not known for sticking with his speaking notes, Ben's topic today is central planning versus spontaneous order, which pretty much means he might be talking about anything. So without further ado, I give you Ben Stone.
Well, thanks for coming out. First speaker of PorcFest is a real honor. Let me change this slightly. There we go. How's that? A little bit better? It's really an honor to be at PorcFest in general. This is the kissing up part, so, but it's really an honor to be asked to come to PorcFest, but it's really great for all of us to be able to get out here and get together. I was here last year for the first time, and, excuse me, and I just couldn't wait to get back because it's so much fun. I mean, the whole week and the general lightness of the whole mood that's here is really refreshing compared to, walking around in the government-controlled world that we live in every day. This is like a little one-week retreat that you can just get away from it. You can be yourself. You see guys walking around open carrying. You see ladies walking around open carrying. And, it's just so comforting to know that you're, at least for a week, you're in a different world. We're free. It's really cool. Anyway, so my topic was supposed to be central planning versus spontaneous order. And I was at the Pennsylvania Libertarian Party's convention last week, and they needed a topic, so I thought, well, I'm already scheduled at PorcFest to use that topic, so I'll use the same topic at the LP convention. And I had my laptop with me, and I had my notes there, and as soon as I read the first line of my notes, then I deviated and went off and talked about other things. So I thought, well, that's probably what I'm going to end up doing here. I'm just going to end up, because if you've ever heard my podcast, about half the time I'm going line by line on my notes and sticking with my topic. If it's something that I've really researched a lot and I really want to get a point across, then I do a pretty good job of following my notes. But then there are key times in my podcast when I get a little excited talking about something, and I go off and just completely lose the topic of the podcast and just ramble for an hour. And I never really know why people want to listen to that, but evidently they do. But anyway, so spontaneous order and central planning. And of course, I think it's in the notes, in the PorcFest notes, if it weren't for some kinds of central planning, we wouldn't be here. This is all planned by a central committee. But the key difference is that none of those people in that central committee have enforcers who will come out and make you come here and attend. And this is the real difference when we think about central planning when governments are involved, because there's only one way a government can ever convince anybody. No, there's two. There's two ways the government can convince people to behave in any particular way. And one is through almost mass hypnotism. It's really more of a religion if you think about it, the religion of believing that government has authority over you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. How's that? Even if your lips brush up against it every once in a while, it's not too bad. Okay. You'll be heard. That's what we want. Okay. Okay, so anyway, governments have two ways of enforcing their will upon us. They can convince us to behave the way that they want through brainwashing, through teaching in schools, through convincing us that we need them, or they can threaten us. They can threaten us either with, tying us up in red tape and not allowing us to do one thing or another through levels and levels of bureaucracy, or ultimately, as many other people have said, the ultimate threat of the state, of the government, is that they'll kill you if you don't comply. They'll first give you a piece of paper, and then and we all know these steps, they'll give you a piece of paper, and if you ignore the piece of paper, they'll give you another piece of paper, and if you ignore that piece of paper, they'll send a guy with the piece of paper, and if you ignore that, they'll send a guy with a gun, and if you ignore that, they'll send a team of guys with guns who will haul you away. And if at any point in this, if you resist, they'll kill you. And this is the same whether we're talking about you didn't mow your lawn in time and so they issued you a ticket, or you killed someone. It really doesn't matter what their crime is, how you violated them. It only matters that you obey. And again, so when we think of central planning, we think about, through government, we think about the two ways that the government has to convince us to obey their central planning. And one is based on mental manipulation, and the other is based on threats of violence. So it's not the central planning that's the problem. It's the method of enforcing it. The central planning that we see before us here is done through voluntarism. We volunteer to come out here and do things, and other people volunteer to come out and watch and to interact and to buy and to sell and to do all the things that we're doing. And this is all through voluntary means. So it's not that central planning is bad. Central planning keeps things functioning. It's that the violence and the brainwashing that is involved in government central planning is what fouls things up. And if you think about it, now, going with spontaneous order, let's go in that direction. If you've ever watched any of the John Stossel things where he compares spontaneous order with central planning, he showed, like one thing he did, he had an ice skating rink. And if you just let people go, just go out there and skate, they kind of create their own order. People tend to figure out how not to ram into each other. But if you go out there and you try to force them to behave the way you want, first off, nobody's going to have any fun, and one person is not smart enough to control all those people in that skating rink. So unless you can assign one person to each person in the skating rink, and that kind of defeats the purpose, then you can't centrally plan, in Stossel's example, you can't centrally plan having fun at an ice skating rink. So that's his example with that. But again, there's really nothing wrong with the central planning, because if you did have a committee and sat down with all those people ahead of time and said, hey, let's centrally plan this activity on the ice. Well, we have a word for that. It's choreography. Dancers do it all the time. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with central planning, again, so long as there's not the threat of violence or the brainwashing that goes with the government. So a lot of times, people who think like libertarians, people who tend to think in that direction, we immediately reject the ideas of central planning because we think of Soviet control, we think of communism, we think of socialism, we think of all these negative words that we're taught to hate. But really, the problem is not in any of those words. The problem is in the actions of forcing someone under threat of violence that they have to obey your will or the will of this small committee. That's where the problem is. So I think it's important for us to be able to really see past what we're asked to see and see the real root problem. And the root is always in aggression. It's not in how the aggression is placed on people. It's not in how many people decide to have the aggression. It's not even in the, we tend to enforce the government's will on a peer-to-peer level. For instance, I was talking to my brother not long ago, and in the discussion, as far too often does, tended towards the difference of he and I in regards to government. And we were talking about building codes. And my suggestion that building codes are unnecessary, that people will tend to build buildings that are safe if the government leaves them alone entirely, this was just appalling to him, to the point of where he was angry at me for even suggesting such a thing. And this is this horizontal enforcement that we see all the time. Well, it's even in that situation, the problem is not that he doesn't understand some of the basic thoughts of liberty. The problem is that he's been brainwashed all his life to think in a certain way. But yet, he's not inflicting violence on me. And he wouldn't be doing that. He's not going to do that. So my problem is not with him. And my frustration may be with him for believing such things, but he's not my enemy. The enemy, ultimately, can be him if suddenly he takes on that role of government enforcer and decides to come to my house, knock on the door, hand me a paper, threaten me with a gun. Then he becomes a personal problem, a personal problem to me. But until that moment that he actually threatens me, then he's just an annoyance, and he's just one of the many people that are brainwashed to think in a certain way. So he's not my enemy. Now, how do I wrap this back around to what I was talking about earlier? Well, you know, so often we think of the government as this blob, as this big faceless entity, and oftentimes we hate it, or at least we hate the results of what it does. You know, what does government do? Government blows people up. Government bombs cities. Government forces people to behave the way government wants. Government steals from us. Government steals from us constantly. Government steals from us in ways that most people don't even think about, through things like inflation and stuff like that. All of us probably understand how inflation is theft, but the vast majority of people have no idea that inflation is intentional and inflation is theft. They don't think of it that way because they've never thought it through. So when we think of government, that's what we tend to think of. But really, that's not the case. Government is the acts of individuals. And a lot of us already understand that. And each one of those individuals is acting not for the purpose of aggressing against us, although that's the ultimate end. But each one of them is acting based on, they're making decisions based on what they perceive to be the best choice they have at that particular time. Well, the problem in that is, we go back to this brainwashing that I was talking about, and the myth that the government is a good thing, and that we need government, and the regulations are a good thing, and that central planning, whether it's a good thing or whether it's a bad thing, it has to be done, because the average person thinks these things through and says, well, we have to have some central planning. There has to be some decision makers. There have to be some leaders. But then they make that leap over to the violent side of it. And the only way we can have that leadership is through force, is by forcing people. If we don't, they won't comply. Everybody will just drive on any side of the road that they want. People will drive as fast as they want. People will build rickety houses that fall over and kill other people. And they never think through the process that all that stuff happens every day. Have you been on the roads? You know? They're crazy. And having the threat of police doesn't really change it all that much. As a matter of fact, and this is going way off the topic, but I did a series on police. And one of the purposes of the series on police was to show that not only do police not do what people think they do, but police actually increase the quantity of crime. The more police you have, the more crime you're going to have. And in addition to that, the more police you have, the more necessary it becomes for the police to create a reason to have more police. So more police create the need for more police create more crime. The solution is more police. And yeah, where does that take us? I mean, it becomes pretty goofy. The problem is seeing that to begin with, and seeing that the origin of the problem was when the police were created. And that's what we need to deal with. Because it goes back to the violence. What are the police? Not the individual who is just making individual decisions. He's delusional, perhaps. He's brainwashed. He is confused. He hasn't been enlightened. All these things might be true. But he's not necessarily our enemy. He's just a person who's making decisions based on the information that he has. He might be a good person. He might be a bad person. He might be a regular person every day that makes bad decisions sometimes. I fit into that category. So I'm not particularly evil, although I think we all have little streaks of evilness in us. You know, our tendency to, maybe not evil, but our tendency to, let me not go in that direction. But my point is that, but the individual actor, whether he be the police or whether he's some bureaucrat way in the depths of offices somewhere just shuffling paper through, just doing his job every day, putting a stamp on there, putting it in the right slot. At whatever level, all of that is based on violence. But the individual doesn't see that. The individual making those actions never sees that. Now, so how can I wrap this back towards central planning and spontaneous order? Well, spontaneous order, by its definition, happens spontaneously. Except if you take an electric cord and you throw it in the back of your pickup truck, the spontaneous order that electric cord is going to create as you drive around is a knot that you're going to have a really hard time unwinding to use that electric cord again. So this is an argument that, in fact, spontaneous order doesn't happen. Spontaneous order only happens when individuals centrally plan it. Central being that one individual is a central planner. So really, there's no such thing as spontaneous order. There's a lot of us making decisions, and those decisions can be based on confused material. They can be based on brainwashing that we've received from television and from the government schools and from family members. Or they can be based on facts and logic, or they can be based on mythology. But it's still individuals making those choices and individuals making those plans. So, in a sense, in a way, there's no such thing as spontaneous order. There's only individuals making decisions. And if you remove the individual, you don't have, there's no life there. There's nothing to make the decision. There's nothing to order. Rocks don't have any particular order. Grass doesn't have any particular order. Decision makers create order. So again, it's not that centrally planning is bad. Centrally planning is actually really good for me when I'm the central planner. And it's really good for you when you're the central planner, or you, right? So it's not that central planning in and of itself is bad. It all goes back to that violence. It's only when my will, my decisions, my central planning is imposed upon another person against their will. And that's where the real problem comes in, because I can't go inside somebody else's mind, and I can't experience all the things that they've experienced in their lifetime. And I can't imagine in my mind all the different things that they're going through in their day-to-day life. So I can't possibly plan that person's life for them. And nobody else can plan mine. Well, this takes us back to the problem of government. If that's the case, if every single person in government, working in government, on every level, is just an individual making decisions, and if it's every single one of those decisions are going to be enforced on the rest of us through threats of violence or brainwashing, well, we have a couple decisions we can make. We can bow and tolerate it. We can attempt to resist it, or we can attempt to educate those actors, those individual people who act. We can attempt to educate them on what they're actually doing. I think all of these methods have a time and a place. You know, the very wise man said that there's a time for peace and a time for war and a time for planting and a time for harvesting. And so I think there's a time when we have to bow our head and just tolerate it, put up with it, look the other way. There's another time to resist, but you have to resist according to wisdom. If you got a bank robber and he's going to, or let's not say a bank robber, you've got a thief on the street. He sticks a gun in your ribs. He's got all the advantages, and he's going to rob you. Well, you have a choice. You can resist him, or you can obey. Well, obeying may be very distasteful, but it's probably better than taking a bullet in the ribs. So you obey. On the other hand, if you judge the situation as such, and let's say the robber doesn't have a gun, let's say he's just threatening at a distance with a knife and you've got a gun, then it might be foolish to give him your money. And it might be more advantageous to take some other action. Well, we face this when we deal with government. Government, we like to have guns, many of us. I'm far more comfortable when I have a gun than when I don't have a gun. I can say the same about knives. We talk a lot about guns in the liberty movement in general, but for me, I'm far more comfortable with a knife than a gun, and having a gun and a knife both available as a primary go-to defense weapon, in most cases, I would go with the knife for a variety of reasons. And I say that not just theoretically. I have had a gun in one pocket and a knife in the other pocket, and had a gun drawn on me. And I chose not to draw my gun, and I dealt with him separately. So it's not just in theory. I'm pointing that out to just say it's not just in theory. I prefer a knife over a gun for a variety of reasons. But now, how did I get off on that topic? See, this is the nice thing about... Oh, yeah, that's right. This is the nice thing about podcasting, because all I have to do is just go back to my notes, pick back up what I was talking about, and then in editing, go through and cut that section out and make it make sense. So I can actually take what I said in the beginning, put it toward the end, take parts of what I said in the end, put it to the beginning, and actually make it sound like I know what I'm talking about. It's great, and nobody knows but me. But, okay, so... let's see, spontaneous order. See if I can grab back onto the thoughts there that took me off in self-defense. Oh, I remember. Okay, so we have a choice of defending ourselves against the acts of government. And that choice can be pretty dangerous. If, let's say the IRS comes and they say, we want this money. And you have that choice. I can bow. I can give them money. I can hope for the best and just continue to submit to the robbery. Or I can flee. Or I can resist. Now, any of these things are valid, but it's wisdom that makes the difference as to whether my actions ultimately produce the best good, or if my actions produce something that's not the best good. So, for instance, in some situations that I'm sure we're all familiar with, where a person has resisted the tax man, and the tax man wins almost all the time. And we can play with legal terms, and you can wrap things up in courts, but ultimately, for lack of a better phrase, this is what the government does for a living. They play this game for a living. They made all the rules themselves. They don't have to obey the rules they made. They can cheat at any time they want, and they almost always win. So what's the profit in resisting? Well, I was just talking to someone about this. When we think of things like civil disobedience, but any type of resistance to the government, what's your purpose in doing it? Is your purpose in doing it to draw the attention of other people so that they can see what oppression they really live under? Because most people have no idea that the only reason they obey government is because they're either afraid of government or they're brainwashed by government. Most people have no idea that that's the case. So that, let's see, when that critical moment comes to make that decision to resist or not, are you doing that because you want other people to wake up and see what it is they live under? Or is it because you want that government to change and behave the way you want it to change, or behave the way you want it to behave? Well, honestly, if it's your intent to change government to behave the way you want it to behave, are you really all that much different than the guy in the uniform? Or are you that much different than the judge? Or are you that much different than the politician? Or are you that much different to anyone else in government? If it's your intention to use government for your purposes, maybe even to save you from having to pay excessive taxes, is it possible that you are actually exactly like those people in government that are oppressing other people? And if you think in that direction, it causes you to start to think to yourself, all those people in government are just like me. They're not evil monsters. They don't have hooves. They don't have like horns. They're not necessarily. You pick out the politician that disgusts you the most, and I'm sure several pop right into your head. But let's just imagine that single politician that disgusts you the most. The odds are, if you could sit down at dinner with them and talk to them, they're probably a really nice person. And you could probably, if you set aside politics, you'd probably actually like that person if it weren't for all the politics involved. Because most of them are just like us. But we tend to not think of him that way. We tend to think, that George W. Bush, I hate that guy. He's a monster. He's a murderer. He's a killer. That Obama, man, that guy, he kills babies. He bombs wedding parties and bombs funerals. He kills first responders. He sends a bomb in, kills people, then he waits until more people come to clean up the mess, and he bombs them. That's what that guy does. He's a monster. He's a hoofing, horned monster. But he's not. If you talk to him in real life, I'll bet he would be like everybody else, because he doesn't think about those things that he's doing. He's convinced that all the stuff that he's doing is good because he has the stamp of government to make it good. Now, I was saying a minute ago that we might all have a little bit of an evil streak in us. I think that evil streak is in the sense of a desire for power. I think all humans, and we may reject it, we may have enough self-discipline that we reject it, but I think all humans have a tiny little urge inside of us for power. And when you take a person and you gang a lot of people around them, and they wave signs with your picture on it, and they applaud for everything you say, and then you give that person the authority to make law, I think deep inside that person, it takes that little streak of evil, that desire for power, and multiplies it, makes it bigger than it would naturally be. And each time that glorification happens to that person, that desire for power gets a little bit bigger and a little bit stronger. And that, I think, is evil. And I'm saying this in a theological sense. I don't have to imagine a devil anywhere. I don't have to imagine a personification of Satan to believe that evil exists. I believe evil exists in the desire of one human being to dominate other human beings and to have that glorification come back to yourself. And in an odd way, it's like, I guess, everything else. I quoted Solomon a moment ago when I said, there's a time of war and a time of peace, and a time to plant and a time to harvest. And he also said that everything under the sun has a season. Everything has a purpose. So whatever that little evil streak that I was talking about serves a purpose in us if it's balanced correctly, if it's used properly. So that the same thing that causes a grandfather to love, to have his grandchildren come up and sit around him and have him talk to those grandchildren and have them adore him. There's something there that's very natural and very productive. But I think deep down the flaw is when that goes outward and in that sense, like government, you begin to want to enforce that upon people and that desire to have them come and adore you like that. If you look at the politicians that are most popular, the people that vote them in practically worship them. No, not practically. They do. They make a god out of that politician. Now, I'm going to talk Friday, and I can't remember what the whatever the topic was that I gave them, but I'm going to deviate from that, and I'm going to kind of drop back in on the thing that I'm touching today, and that is what is evil? What is Satan? What is the devil? What really is that in reality? I don't mean to offend anybody of any particular religion. That's not my purpose in doing this. But I don't think there's a person who is a devil who carries a pitchfork or however you want to, personify him. I think evil is that little piece of us that desires to dominate other human beings. And I'm going to talk about that on Friday, and I'm also going to talk about the flip side of that. What is a god? How do you create a god? How do you destroy a god? Well, it's done in here. Now, I'm not saying, I'm not an atheist, I'm a theist. I believe that there is something beyond humanity. But I can't prove that, okay? So I'm not attempting to offend anybody who is a theist, who believes in God, and I'm not attempting to convert anybody who's an atheist. But I think there's another thing that we can create in our mind that is a thing that we worship, a God. And when we believe enough, then that God exists. And I've used the example before. I used this example in Philadelphia, in Harrisburg the other day at the LP convention. Zeus was a very popular god. And he lived on a mountain, and he did things. He manipulated people. Occasionally, he manifested himself as different animals or as different people, and he came and interacted with humans. And Zeus did all these things for a very long period of time. And then something odd happened. People stopped believing in Zeus, and they started believing in Jupiter. And Zeus disappeared. The imagination in the mind that created Zeus was gone, and Zeus was gone. Oh, his statues are still here, his temples are still here, but he was gone. And there's Jupiter. And Jupiter was pretty much the same thing as Zeus until all of a sudden people stopped believing in him. Well, it wasn't all of a sudden, it happened over about 600 years. But over that time frame, people stopped believing in Jupiter. And there's no Jupiter. He's gone. He doesn't exist. For the longest time, the ice sheets were kept from invading Europe because Thor and Odin and several others fought the ice giants and kept the ice sheets off of Europe. As long as Odin was fighting the ice giants, the ice sheets could not invade Europe. And then one day, people stopped believing in Odin, and the ice sheets didn't come back. Because Odin, in a sense, never really existed, but yeah, he did too. He existed completely in the minds of people who were convinced that Odin kept the ice sheets back. And again, this is teaser for Friday. What I want to talk about on Friday is that we have ways of thinking in our mind today that are just as silly as believing that Odin holds back the ice sheets. All of us, even me, all of us have these thoughts in our minds that certain things are legitimate and that certain things are necessary and that humans will behave in certain ways if this and if that. We believe those things. And because we believe those things, we make decisions and we take actions. And each time we do that, in a sense, if we're supporting the idea of Odin, then we're creating Odin. Odin is real. And that's what we do with the state. As we believe that the actions of government are good and necessary and required, or even if we say, you know, I don't really like what government does, but if I can get government off my back onto this thing, and so that I can get a little bit more of my tax money back, you're still in a sense believing that there's a certain amount of legitimacy to that, or maybe not legitimacy, but you're believing that you can interact with a thing that doesn't exist. Even when you're trying to get government to leave you alone, you're trying to get an entity to do something that doesn't exist. But what does exist is those individual people. And that's, in my mind, the single largest vulnerability to government is that it is made up of millions of individuals. And individuals are unbelievably powerful. When we think, we can create things that don't exist. But also, when we think, we can separate out those things and realize what really does exist. And as more and more people who function in government come to this conclusion, you know, what's the guy's name? Snow, something with Snow? Yeah. There. When it dawned on him that what he was doing was wrong, then immediately he had to deal with that. What am I going to do? Am I going to bow my head? Am I going to look the other way? And am I going to continue to do my job? Am I going to fight? Am I going to resist? Am I going to put my head on the chopping block and say, I'm going to die, but this is going to be released? Or a third option that I've been talking about lately, he can stay right where he's at and just mess things up really bad. And I think there's a place for all those things. Sometimes you have to bow your head. Sometimes you have to stand up and you have to say, no, I'm not going to take this. But there are other times where you say, you know what? I'm going to sit at my desk and I'm going to delay every piece of paper that comes across my desk. And I'm going to do my job really, really crappy. And I'm going to slow this thing down in every way I can. And all those things are legitimate. I have no idea how long I've been talking. Any idea? Okay. Do we want to do a question and answer thing, or we're asking that because this is being recorded, we want to be sure and have microphones to everybody so that their questions can be recorded, and so we don't just have big blank spots. So
put your mouth like
go ahead.
Directly on.
I want to disagree with you politely about, you said Obama, Bush, you named a couple people, really are nice people. They're just like us, and I disagree. And what it is they're not nice people because of what they do. They act like us so that we will not push against them. What is really lost here is the self-defense art of judo. In judo, when you're attacked, you don't counterattack. You go with the attack. When you're pushed, you go with the push. But you keep going, and you take that person with you, and you use that. When I fight the IRS, I go with them. When they say that they want my money, I say, okay, I've got the checkbook right here. I've got it all filled out just for my signature. As soon as you give me the law that makes me subject to the tax, I'm going to sign my name here. And in 13 years, they've never done that.
I would have two things that I'd want to comment about that. First off, I appreciate that, and I think that is a fabulous act of bravery, and I really appreciate you doing that. My fear is, I talk about it like you've got to imagine a cave with a dragon, and the cave is lying. You know, dragons like to, as we all know the personality of dragons, they like to hoard wealth and then just lay on it. They don't really do anything. They spoil it, actually, but they like to hoard wealth and then just lay on it. And, you know, if we can get in and snatch one of those coins out of there, then great, if you can do that. If you can get in there and even break off one of its little scales, because the dragon scale is really handy. It's really good for a lot of different things. But the problem is, the moment that the dragon fully realizes you're there, you're dead. You have no chance. And I hope that the full blunt of that dragon never comes upon you. And I really hope that what you're saying works. And
add that I'm open and notorious about this. I don't hide anything, and I've just written my 53rd letter to the state revenue agency and my 49th letter to the Internal Revenue. So I'm not hiding anything. I'm right out in the open.
I really hope that works for you. I really do. And, you know, in theory, too, and I think we can probably agree on this, if we had 50,000 people that could do that in 1 year, we'd cripple the system. If we had 100,000 people that could do that in 1 year, the government would have no chance against us, you know.
Actually over 1 million people doing some sort of this, so it's not a small number of people.
I think eventually it'll grow even bigger, though. One of the great flaws within government, and I was kind of referring to that with people who sit there at their desk and just say, you know, I'm going to do my job really crappy, and I'm just not going to, you know, I'm not going to do anything more than I'm forced to do. And the more people in government that actually behave that way, the worse government runs and the better it is for all of us. So, so to a large extent, we depend on those inefficiencies in government in doing that, and eventually that's going to be the downfall of government. Yeah.
Just so, since we're still on that subject, you said that they're a lot like us. They want to change the government. We want to change the government. But they demand us to pay them a full-time salary to change the government in the manner that they want. And we often, when we try to change government, we are giving up some of our wealth. There's a difference.
That is true. We're on the receiving side of that gun, and they're on the holding side of the gun. I did want to mention too. I was in a discussion with an old friend. This is several years ago, and I was trying to, at the time, I was trying to explain to him why people at the head of government are evil people. They're just bad people. And he asked me if I'd ever met. We were talking. This was during George W. Bush's administration. And he asked me if I'd ever met a president, and I said no, I haven't, you know. And he responded that he actually had met George Herbert Walker Bush, the, you know, Bush 1. I call him Papa Bush. He actually did meet. He was in, I think, Kosovo, if I recall, somewhere during that whole mess that was happening in there. And the first George Bush actually went to his tent where he was stationed and sat down and talked to him for about 45 minutes. And what he had been deployed in some very nasty situations, and he had come real close to losing his life a couple times. And prior to George Bush going over there, Papa Bush actually went and talked to this guy's parents and found out about him, and then went over and communicated with him and asked if there was any messages. And he did, and it wasn't a photo op. There were no cameras. There was nothing. This was never publicized. So it's not like you can say, well, that was just a setup. It could have been that they set it up and didn't use it. But his explanation of that to me was that no, the guy actually found out about the close calls that he'd had, went to his family, talked to his family, and then as a part of his trip over there, deviated from his schedule and went and sat with him for 45 minutes and talked to him. So it nullified my argument that these people are bad people, and it made me rethink, well then why are they behaving the way? How can a normal human being say yes, kill those people in that wedding party? How can he do that? There's got to be a different thing in there that sets it apart, that justifies that kind of action, that makes it, when he looks at that, he says, yeah, that's an acceptable thing in order for us to accomplish this other thing. I don't know. I don't know how a person can do that. But yeah.
What did Solzhenitsyn teach us?
Expound.
That before people do evil, they think they're doing good. There's a very famous quote by Solzhenitsyn. He basically just says what I just said, that anybody who actually does evil always thinks they're doing good first. They're doing God's good work.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
I just want to make a comment. I really was interested in, first of all, when you talked about the bias against spontaneous order, and also when you touched on religion, I couldn't help but think that the ultimate central planner is this idea of this God out there, and I was wondering if you think religious teachings play into this bias against or for central planning, this idea that something has to design everything, or that there has to be some ultimate thing out there calling the shots, if that plays into this kind of thinking that so many have. And I would argue that it's not just within the realm of the public sphere or the government sphere, but also private sphere as well. People have a bias towards central planning. So I just wondered about what you think about the religious correlation there.
I think so. I think a lot of religious thought is polluted by that desire for power, and the marriage that's taken place throughout the ages between the rulers and the use of religion to keep us bound, you know. And I'm not saying that to denounce all religion. Certainly, you know, there are lots of religious beliefs that do not involve dominating other people. But I think it does. I think it does throw the bias into the general way of thinking when we think of, boy, how do I say this diplomatically acceptable? When we think of a God that's, oh boy, all right. When we think of a God who's going to who's created a system, and if we violate that system, he's going to punish us for eternity. I kind of have a problem with that, because that doesn't really sound like anything else in nature, and it doesn't really sound like a guy I'd want to hang out with, you know. So, but that sounds very much like what central planners in government think, that they actually want us to behave the way that they're going to behave, or they're going to beat us for eternity. So, you know,
I just wanted to address that question you asked, and to me, the question is answered by Lord Acton's maxim on power. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Mm-hmm. What was the central theme of the Tolkien Ring trilogy?
Yeah.
If you have the power to work your will on others without their consent, it is a defining, corrupting force on you. And Tolkien, you know, you can't find a better example of that principle than Tolkien's story.
Yeah, that's a perfect example, actually.
I was wondering why you prefer knives over guns.
I don't see all that well. Yeah, I have a couple of things. One is going to sound a little insane. I think, so I'll say the insane one first. You know, the ultimate act of self-defense is in taking the life of another person. And of course we should avoid that whenever possible. But ultimately, if you have to take the life of another person in self-defense, then I think you ought to be close enough to see them and look in their face. And again, I kind of see the insanity in that. You know, because if someone's going to kill you, you want them as far away as possible when you kill them. But somehow I can't explain it, but I feel like that if I have to take a life in self-defense, I need to look them right in the face. I need to be within touching distance of them. And by far, in this realm right here, where I can reach, I'm more comfortable with a blade than a gun. Also, because of my vision problems, I can see pretty good for about 5 or 10 feet, and then beyond that, all the faces out there, my my mother's passed away, but my mother could be sitting out there and I wouldn't be able to recognize her because, you know. So even with glasses, I'm a lot more comfortable within this realm where I can see good and feel and touch than reaching out, you know, and touching someone that way. And I've never been that good of a shooter. I'm pretty good with a rifle, actually. I'm really good with a rifle. But with a handgun, I'm not all that effective. But I see the necessity of a handgun because if I can't get within reach of, let's say, a crazed, boy, this is not going to happen here. Let's say a crazed shooter comes in here, the odds of me being able to get to him with a knife are pretty thin. So for that reason, I would probably have to, you know, rely on the heavier equipment. But up close, and within a house, I should say this too, to defend my home when my children were little, I never really worried about my kids getting a hold of one of my guns because I taught my children well on the seriousness of guns. So that was never an issue in my house. Thank you. But I always felt like it's the middle of the night, perhaps there's an intruder. The last thing I want is to accidentally shoot a family member. And again, with my vision problems, I'm a lot more comfortable. And in my own house, even if it's pitch black dark, I know where I'm at. And any intruder is not going to know where he's at. So I can move through the house relatively quietly and get within range to where I can absolutely see what the threat is and identify that it's not a family member before taking action. And also, here's the last thing on that. I use a knife every day to do something, you know, cut breakfast or whatever, trim my fingernails. I'm constantly using a knife. And at my best, when I was going to the range as often as I could, it was never more than once a week. So I'm never going to be able to handle a gun to the point of where I'm at a comfort level like I am with a knife. And a knife has just almost become, you know, second nature to me. And let me give a quick commercial. This is a Recon 1, and I almost didn't buy it because it's just big and bulky and stuff, and it was uncomfortable to hold when I first got it. But let me tell you, these things are nice. This is a Recon 1. I got it on Amazon. You don't have to use my link, but I was really amazed at these. Ask me about it later and feel it for yourself. They're really nice knives. Anyway, yeah.
Hey, so I have a question. I heard you say two things which kind of seem contradictory to me, and I wanted to get your. I wanted to suggest another option about that, and also get your thoughts on it. The first thing you talked earlier on about how police breed more police and throw money at the problem, throw more cops at the problem, and that's what seems to be what people think will solve the solution. And then you also mentioned kind of slowing down the bureaucratic machine. Now I work for a community college, so it's kind of public a little bit. We get some taxpayer money, but we also get money through tuition and some private companies and stuff like that, donations. So that to me seems to be the same thing happens in a bureaucracy, that by slowing it down, throwing more money, bringing in more people, that breeding that in that public, that business environment that's quasi-public and quasi-private can create that same expansion of government. So what I want to offer is what I try to do. I don't know how effective it is, but I try to breed an idea of respect of what we've been given to work with. And I try to breed efficiency where I can, and just breed that in the people around me, and just say, hey, this money does come from other people. This is other people's money that, I don't necessarily go into how it was forced out of them, but that breeding that respect and bringing efficiency to something like that can also be a way to further our cause.
I would agree that it can be in the sense of you communicating with the people around you, coworkers and so forth like that. It can be a way of saying, look, I'm setting a good example. This is, money from that. I tend to look at it on a slightly different level, though, because I and I use this word very specifically and intentionally, I hate government. I hate it. I hate the concept of government. I hate every aspect of government. I hate the myth of the state that is supported through this whole process. I want it dead. I want every aspect of it dead. And the best way that I've come up with in my mind to deal with this is to almost encourage or allow the government to get as big and as nasty and as intrusive as it needs to get, so that people will see it, and so that they will say, I'm not paying it. And they will say, I'm done with this, and reject it and completely throw it out. And the only way that I have seen, and I've seen the different arguments of reduce government until it's so small that we don't, well, yeah, if you reduce government to the point of where it doesn't bother anybody, we still have government, and I still hate it. Or you can get government to work so efficiently that we don't mind it, that it steals almost nothing from us, but it's still there, and I still hate it, and I want it dead. Go ahead.
I liked your point about a lot of government officials aren't evil people. It's the situation they're put in. I just wanted to thought that occurred to me was if you look at like the Stanford prison experiment or like Abu Ghraib, you have like a lot of normal college kids or whatever who put in these situations, and suddenly they start torturing people. And I'm right. There's a story of Ludwig von Mises. Someone asked him, if you were made the economic dictator, what is the first thing you would do? And they wanted to hear like, I don't know, I would first repeal the price controls or whatever. He said the first thing I would do is resign. Because he knew, even me, I do nothing but write books against government. You put me in government, the first thing I'll do is act the exact same way everyone else in government does. I guess it does something to your mind, and it'd probably be humbling for all of us to realize if any of us were in the political power, we'd probably do the exact same thing they do.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. That's what this gentleman was saying a second ago. That's that ring of power concept that, it doesn't, in Tolkien's story, he took the most humble, the most harmless, the best things alive were the hobbits in many, many ways. And even the hobbit could be corrupted. She's got one more question here.
I was wondering, some anti-government types talk about making a point to bankrupt the state by getting as much money from it as possible. Do you think that's a viable option?
As long as we're staying within the zero aggression principle, and as long as we're not, I'm opposed to lying. I embrace the truth as much as humanly possible, as much as is possible for me. So for me, I believe that as long as we're embracing the zero aggression principle, and as long as we're not actually lying, then I think we should bleed the government of every nickel we can get out of it. We should encourage as many people to waste as much government money as possible, force government to raise taxes to 90%, 95%, 98%, 100%. And as it does that, I believe that it will be bleeding money in so many directions that the people in general would say, we've had enough, and they'll look for an alternative. And and let me throw this out. We're probably about out of time. Let me just throw this last thought out. Keep in mind that the alternative is never revolution, because revolution simply takes one government, one tyrant, and puts in another. And that's the exact opposite of what we want. Almost every revolution through history has produced a new government that was worse than the last. And that's the opposite of what we need. So what we need is not necessarily a revolution. We need to reject the whole process. We need to open people's eyes to see exactly how evil government is, and how that myth of government, what I call the state, I separate the difference between government being those people who act and the state being the myth that people believe in. As soon as we can get people to see that myth and the lie, then they can all refuse to cooperate. And it won't be one guy here and one guy there. It will be whole huge communities that turn on their government, not to revolt, not to have a revolution, but just to say, we're stepping out of this completely. We're not going to support you anymore. We're not going to file the paperwork. We're not going to go to the courthouse. Today, we have huge risks when we do that. But at some point in time, masses will do that, and the whole myth will evaporate, and Zeus will be gone, and he will never come back. Folks, thanks a lot.
Picked up an angel whose left wing was broken. I sewed him together with some string and a vision. He raised his right hand and he gave me an answer. My mouth opened wide and I asked many questions. I see crowds of people all gathered around me. They all want the truth, but they don't want to hear it. I fear they will rob me if I dare to speak it. But poverty bears the fruit of the prophet. And oh, I am nothing